The Galactic Accord fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel above New Geneva on the 273rd day of the invasion. And High Commander Desic stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the planet below with emotions he could barely identify or understand. He had argued against intervention for months, insisting that humanity had not earned the right to Accord protection. But the reports from New Geneva had changed something fundamental in his perception of the small, fierce species from Earth. 9 months of continuous warfare against a superior enemy, and the humans still held their mountains. Tens of thousands of Dominion soldiers had been killed or wounded, and their fleet had been crippled by a suicide attack that defied every principle of rational self-preservation. And yet, Supreme Commander Keth still had not achieved the quick victory that everyone had expected. Signal the Dominion forces, Desic commanded, and inform them that this system is now under Accord protection by unanimous vote of the Council. The message was transmitted, and within hours, Supreme Commander Keth requested a meeting to discuss surrender terms, because his remaining forces were exhausted and demoralized after months of fighting an enemy that simply refused to accept defeat. Admiral Beek Minje had survived the space battle, rescued from the wreckage of her flagship by a destroyer that had pulled her escape pod from the debris field, and she insisted on being present. When Keth formally surrendered his sword, Captain Park Ji-hung descended from the mountains with the 167 soldiers who remained from his original force of 400, and they stood in formation as the Dominion commander emerged from his headquarters with lowered eyes and slumped shoulders. Keth approached Admiral Beek and extended his ceremonial weapon with trembling hands, and he could not bring himself to look at the small human female, who had cost him more than half his invasion fleet. "I offer my surrender," he said, his voice hollow with defeat and confusion. "And I request that my soldiers be treated according to the conventions of warfare." "Your soldiers will be treated fairly," Beek replied, and she took the weapon with a steady grip that showed no sign of the injury she still carried from the battle. As befits honorable enemies who fought with courage, even in an unjust cause, she could have humiliated him further, could have demanded apologies and reparations, an acknowledgement of human superiority. But she chose instead to accept his surrender, with the dignity that her people had earned through 9 months of blood and sacrifice. This restraint impressed the sick more than any display of military prowess could have done. The following week, the Galactic Accord convened an emergency session to vote on human membership, and Ambassador Yoon Seo-jin stood at the central podium once again as representatives from 12 species watched in respectful silence. "I come before you today," she began, and her voice carried the weight of everything her people had endured since she last stood in this chamber, not to request membership, but to accept it. Desic rose from his seat and descended to the chamber floor, his towering insectoid form moving with careful deliberation as he approached the human diplomat who barely reached his chest. "On behalf of the Varix hegemony," he said, "I present the motion to grant full membership status to the United Earth Coalition, with all rights and protections that status entails." His compound eyes met Seo-jin's gaze, and the High Commander who had once laughed at human weakness now bowed his head in acknowledgement of human strength. "I was wrong about your species," he said, quietly enough that the translation systems barely picked up his words. "And I apologize for the suffering my arrogance caused." Seo-jin accepted his apology with a graceful nod, because holding grudges served no purpose when the future offered opportunities for alliance and mutual benefit. And she understood that this moment would shape relationships between their species for centuries to come. The vote was unanimous in favor of membership, and for the first time in Accord history, every representative rose to their feet in recognition of a new member species. In the years that followed, human military doctrine spread through the armed forces of the Accord like fire through dry grass. transforming how a dozen species understood warfare and sacrifice and determination. The concept of the sniper became standard curriculum in Varric's war colleges, teaching soldiers to strike from impossible distances with patience and precision rather than relying solely on speed and aggression. The role of the combat medic, running toward danger to save wounded comrades, was adopted by the Crothon, despite their natural armor making such rescue less necessary, because they recognized the psychological power of knowing that your people would never abandon you. Guerrilla tactics and psychological warfare and the dozen other innovations that humans had developed through millennia of internal conflict became tools that the Accord could use against enemies who threatened their member worlds. The Dominion of Wrath withdrew from Accord borders and never again launched offensive operations against protected systems, because their military planners had learned a lesson that would haunt their strategic calculations for generations. Some enemies could not be conquered. Some prey would rather die than submit, and humans were something new in the galaxy, something that combined the determination of a persistence predator with the social bonds of a pack species and the accumulated knowledge of endless warfare. When asked by alien historians what had made humans so effective during the siege of New Geneva, Admiral Beak Minje gave an answer that became famous across 100 worlds. "You expected us to know when we were beaten," she said, "but we never learned how." Captain Park Ji-hoon retired from military service and returned to New Geneva, where he spent his remaining years helping to rebuild the colony that he had fought so hard to defend. And when he died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 93, his funeral was attended by representatives from every species in the Galactic Accord. His gravestone bore a simple inscription that captured everything humanity had proven during those terrible 9 months of war. We held the line, and the galaxy never forgot. Supreme Commander Keth stood on the bridge of the Dominion's mightiest battlecruiser and watched the planet of New Geneva grow larger on his view screen. And he felt nothing but contempt for the general who had failed so completely against such inferior opponents. General Varath had been relieved of command and sent home in disgrace, his military career destroyed by his inability to crush a few hundred humans hiding in the mountains. And Keth intended to demonstrate how a real warrior handled primitive resistance fighters. He had brought a full invasion fleet to ensure there would be no more embarrassing delays, with 40 warships and 20,000 soldiers ready to overwhelm any opposition through sheer numbers and firepower. And he expected the campaign to be finished within a week. Signal from an approaching vessel, his sensor officer reported. Configuration matches known human military designs. Keth examined the tactical display and saw a small fleet of human ships emerging from faster-than-light travel near the edge of the system. And he counted only 12 vessels compared to his 40, with most of them appearing old and poorly maintained by galactic standards. "They cannot be serious," Keth said, his scaled features twisting into an expression of amused disbelief. Admiral Beak Minje commanded the human fleet from her flagship, and she knew exactly how outmatched her forces were as she studied the Dominion formation arrayed before her. But she had not come to win through superior firepower. She had come to buy time, and to show the galaxy what humanity was willing to sacrifice for their own people. Supreme Commander Keth. She transmitted on open frequencies. "This is Admiral Beak Minje of the United Earth Coalition, and I am ordering you to withdraw your forces from human space immediately." Keth's laughter echoed across the bridge of his battlecruiser, and he took a moment to appreciate the absurdity of this tiny human female demanding surrender from the mightiest fleet the Dominion had ever assembled. "Admiral," he replied, "you are outnumbered 4-1 by ships that are individually superior to anything in your fleet. and I am offering you one opportunity to withdraw your forces before I destroy them completely. I appreciate the offer, Beak replied, but I must decline. She closed the communication channel and turned to her tactical officer with an expression of calm determination that seemed almost peaceful despite the certain death that waited ahead. All ships, execute attack pattern Omega, she commanded. And may our ancestors watch over us. The human fleet surged forward with an aggression that caught the Dominion completely off guard. Because no sane species would charge into such overwhelming odds. And Keth found himself shouting orders as his carefully planned formation dissolved into chaos. Human ships flew in tight clusters that would have caused catastrophic collisions for any species with slower reflexes, weaving between Dominion vessels at speeds that seemed almost impossible. And they struck at weak points in the enemy formation, with a precision that spoke of desperate courage rather than technological advantage. The Dominion returned fire with plasma weapons that should have ended the battle in seconds. But the human ships moved like living things, dodging and spinning through fields of deadly energy while delivering their own attacks with relentless accuracy. Keth watched in disbelief as one human cruiser took a direct hit that should have destroyed it completely. Its hull breached an atmosphere venting into space, and then continued fighting as if nothing had happened. The wounded ship altered course and accelerated directly toward a Dominion carrier. And Keth realized what the human captain intended only seconds before impact. All ships, evasive action, he screamed. The collision tore through the carrier's engine section with devastating force, destroying both vessels in a fireball that temporarily blinded sensors across the battlefield. And Keth felt something he had not experienced in decades of warfare. He felt fear. The battle raged for 3 hours, far longer than anyone had predicted, and when the last human ship finally fell silent, Keth surveyed the wreckage with hollow eyes that reflected the magnitude of his losses. 18 Dominion warships destroyed or disabled. Over 6,000 soldiers dead. The human fleet was gone, reduced to scattered debris that drifted through the system like the remains of fallen warriors. But they had extracted a price that would echo through Dominion military history for generations. Sir, his communications officer said quietly. What are your orders? Keth stared at the planet below, where Captain Park and his resistance fighters were surely preparing to welcome his depleted ground forces. And he understood for the first time why General Varath had failed so completely against these impossible creatures. Continue the invasion, he said, because he had no other choice. Land the troops and establish a perimeter. His remaining transports descended through the atmosphere as darkness fell across New Geneva's northern continent. And somewhere in the mountains above the landing zone, Captain Park watched the lights of descending ships with tired eyes that still burned with unbroken determination. They're coming, Sergeant Quan reported, her voice carrying the exhaustion of 9 months of continuous guerrilla warfare. Yes, Park replied, and he allowed himself a small smile despite everything. But they are fewer than before, and they are scared now. He turned to face his soldiers, the survivors of a campaign that had cost them half their original number. And he saw no fear in their eyes despite the fresh enemy reinforcements descending from orbit. The Admiral bought us time, Park said, and we will not waste her sacrifice. That night, as Dominion forces established their new forward base, explosions began echoing through the mountains. Once again, the humans were far from finished. High Commander Desic sat in his private chambers on the Accord Station and reviewed the intelligence reports with growing unease, because the information on his screen contradicted everything he thought. He knew about warfare and survival and the natural order of predator and prey. The human resistance on New Geneva had now been fighting for 4 months against a force that outnumbered them by more than 10 to 1. And instead of breaking under the pressure as any reasonable species would have done, they seemed to be getting stronger. "This is impossible," Desic muttered to himself as he scrolled through casualty figures that made no sense. No species can sustain losses like this and continue fighting. The reports indicated that human forces had suffered over 30% casualties since the invasion began, which should have triggered complete psychological collapse. According to every military model, the Variks had developed over 2,000 years of galactic warfare. Most species broke at 10% casualties, with their survival instincts overriding any commitment to abstract concepts like territory or honor. And even the most stubborn races the Accord had ever encountered surrendered once there. Losses reached 20%, but the humans just kept fighting. Desic called an emergency meeting of the Accord's Military Intelligence Division, summoning experts from 6 different species to help him understand what they were witnessing on New Geneva. And the conference chamber filled with confused and uncomfortable officers who had no answers to give. "Let us start with the basics," Desic said. "What do we actually know about human biology and psychology?" A Mindari scientist named Velosk activated a holographic display showing human anatomical diagrams, and her voice carried the clinical detachment of a researcher discussing laboratory specimens rather than a sapient species. Humans evolved on a world with unusually high gravity and a corrosive oxygen atmosphere, she began, which forced them to develop robust cardiovascular systems and dense musculature compared to most galactic species. "We knew this already," Desic interrupted impatiently. "Tell me something that explains their behavior." "I am getting to that," Velosk replied, her feathered crest rising slightly with irritation. "Human evolutionary history reveals that they developed as persistence predators, meaning they hunted not by ambush or speed, but by simply following their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion." This revelation caused murmurs of surprise throughout the chamber, because most galactic predator species relied on quick kills that minimized energy expenditure and risk. And the concept of chasing prey for hours or even days seemed almost pathological in its wastefulness. Their bodies can continue functioning through levels of damage and fatigue that would incapacitate other species, Velos continued. And their psychological profiles show an unusual capacity for sustained stress that we previously misidentified as mental instability. "What do you mean by that?" asked Representative Gromax of the Crothon, his rocky voice rumbling with concern. "When humans experience prolonged danger, they do not simply adapt to the stress and become passive," Velosk explained. "Instead, they enter a state that their own researchers call determination, where their focus and aggression actually increase in proportion to the threat they face." Desic felt cold, despite the carefully regulated temperature of the chamber, because he was beginning to understand what the Dominion had stumbled into on New Geneva. "There is something else," Velosk said, her voice dropping to a quieter tone. "Humans form social bonds of unusual intensity, and these bonds create behavioral patterns that override individual self-preservation instincts." She displayed historical footage from human conflicts throughout their history, showing soldiers throwing themselves on explosive devices to protect their companions, medics running into active combat zones to retrieve wounded comrades, and fighters continuing to resist long after their situation became mathematically hopeless. "They will die for each other," Velosk said, "not because they fail to understand the danger, but because they consider the survival of their community more important than their own lives." The chamber fell silent as the representatives absorbed this information, and Desic found himself remembering his dismissive words when Ambassador Seogen had requested Accord membership. He had called humans soft prey animals, and he had laughed at their slow reflexes and fragile bodies, and he had assumed that their history of internal warfare was evidence of primitive savagery rather than accumulated expertise. Now he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. "High Commander," said a junior officer, who had been monitoring communications from the New Geneva system. "We are receiving a transmission from Ambassador Seojin. Put it through." Desik commanded. Ambassador Yoon Seojin appeared on the main display, and Desik noticed that she looked different from the nervous diplomat who had pleaded for membership 4 months ago, because her eyes held a cold fire that reminded him uncomfortably of the predators from his own homeworld. "Honored representatives of the Galactic Accord," Seojin said, "I am once again requesting emergency assistance for the human colony of New Geneva." "Ambassador," Desik began, "as I explained before, Earth is not a member of the Accord, and therefore, I am aware of your previous position," Seojin interrupted, and her voice carried an edge that silenced the High Commander mid-sentence. "I simply wanted to inform you that New Geneva still stands despite 4 months of continuous assault by Dominion forces." She paused to let that information sink in before continuing. "I also wanted to ask you a question," she said. "Given what you now know about human military capabilities, how long do you believe your own worlds would survive under similar circumstances?" The transmission ended before anyone could respond, and the chamber remained silent for a long time as 12 species contemplated a future where humans might be enemies rather than allies. Desik dismissed the meeting and returned to his chambers, where he spent the rest of the night reviewing everything the Accord knew about humanity. He did not like what he found. The Great Hall of the Galactic Accord stretched for nearly a kilometer in every direction, its crystalline walls catching the light of 3 artificial suns that hung suspended in the dome ceiling above. And within this magnificent chamber, representatives from 12 spacefaring species had gathered to discuss a matter that most of them considered barely worth their time. Ambassador Yoon Seojin stood at the central podium, her formal diplomatic robes feeling heavy on her shoulders as she looked up at the towering figures seated in the tiered galleries around her. And she reminded herself to breathe slowly and speak clearly, because this moment would determine humanity's place in the galaxy for generations to come. "Honored representatives of the Galactic Accord," she began, her voice amplified by translation technology that converted her words into a dozen different languages simultaneously. "I come before you today to formally request full membership status for the United Earth Coalition and its 3 colony worlds." High Commander Desik of the Verix leaned forward in his seat, his compound eyes glittering with barely concealed amusement as he studied the small human female standing alone on the chamber floor, and his mandibles clicked together in what his species considered polite laughter. The Verix were insectoid beings who stood nearly 3 meters tall, with armored exoskeletons that could deflect most conventional weapons and reflexes so fast that they could snatch flying objects out of the air without conscious thought. And they had dominated galactic military affairs for over 2,000 years. "The Council recognizes High Commander Desik," announced the Accord's presiding arbiter, a being of pure energy contained within a magnetic sphere. "I have reviewed the military assessment of Earth's armed forces," Desik said, his translated voice carrying a tone of dismissive condescension that needed no interpretation. "And I must confess that I found the experience quite entertaining." A wave of chittering and rumbling laughter passed through the galleries as representatives from other species shared in the joke, and Seojin felt her cheeks flush with anger even as she maintained her diplomatic composure. Desik activated a holographic display that showed footage of human soldiers training on Earth, their movements captured by Accord observation drones that had been monitoring humanity ever since first contact 3 years ago. And the images showed men and women running obstacle courses, firing weapons, and engaging in hand-to-hand combat exercises. Observe their reaction times. Desik said, as he slowed the footage to highlight a soldier dodging a simulated attack. A full quarter-second delay between stimulus and response, which means that any Varix warrior could strike them 4 times before they even began to move. He switched to another clip showing human soldiers in body armor, and he overlaid comparison images of a Crotham warrior whose natural hide was thick enough to stop standard plasma rounds. Their bodies are soft and fragile, filled with liquid that spills out at the slightest puncture, and they must wrap themselves in external shells just to survive minor impacts that would not even bruise a Crothan child. Representative Gromax of the Crothan species nodded his massive head in agreement, his rocky features shifting into what might have been a smile if his face had been capable of such expression. And finally, Desik continued, switching to footage of human weapons testing. They still use kinetic projectile weapons, throwing small pieces of metal at their enemies, like primitives hurling stones. When the rest of the galaxy abandoned such crude technology centuries ago, Seojin waited until Desik finished his presentation before speaking again. And when she did, her voice was calm and measured despite the fury burning in her chest. The United Earth Coalition does not claim to match the Varix in speed or the Crothon in natural armor, she said. But we believe that we have qualities that would make us valuable allies to the Accord, including our adaptability, our determination, and our capacity for creative problem solving. Creative problem solving, Desik repeated, his mandibles clicking with undisguised scorn. Is that what you call it when your species spent 3,000 years killing each other with increasingly elaborate methods before you finally managed to achieve basic planetary unity? We learned from those conflicts, Seojin replied, and the lessons cost us dearly. But they made us who we are. What you are, Desik said, rising from his seat to address the full council, is a species of soft prey animals who have somehow stumbled into space travel through sheer luck, rather than any inherent capability. And I move that the Council grant Earth only observer status without the protection of our mutual defense treaties. The vote was swift and decisive, with 8 species voting in favor of Desik's motion, 2 abstaining, and only the Mindari and the Pelori voting in opposition. And Sayunian accepted the decision with a formal bow before leaving the chamber with what dignity she could maintain. 3 weeks later, the Dominion of Wrath invaded New Geneva. The Dominion were a predatory empire that had been probing the borders of Accord space for decades, testing defenses and seeking weakness. And they saw humanity's unprotected colony world as an easy target that would send a message to the galaxy about their growing power. General Vorath commanded the invasion force personally, bringing 5,000 soldiers and a dozen warships to conquer a planet defended by only 400 human military personnel and 3,000 civilians. And he expected the operation to be complete within a single day. Ambassador Seojin immediately contacted the Galactic Accord to request emergency assistance, citing the unprovoked aggression against a world that had harmed no one. But High Commander Desik's response was delivered with cold satisfaction. Earth is not a member of the Accord, he said, and therefore not entitled to our protection, which is precisely the outcome we warned you about when you came begging for status you had not earned. People will die, Seojin said, her diplomatic composure finally cracking. Yes, Desik agreed. They will. And perhaps the survivors will learn something from the experience. Assuming there are any survivors at all, the transmission ended, and Seojin sat alone in her office on the Accord station, knowing that help would not come and that the people of New Geneva would have to face the Dominion alone. What she did not know, what no one in the galaxy could have predicted, was that General Vorath was about to make the worst mistake of his military career. He was about to learn why humans had spent 3,000 years fighting each other, and why the lessons they learned had made them into something that the galaxy had never seen before. The Dominion expected easy prey. They would find something else entirely. General Vorath stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the planet below with the confident satisfaction of a predator who had already claimed his kill. And the green and brown sphere of New Geneva looked peaceful and vulnerable as his invasion force descended through the upper atmosphere. All units report ready for landing, his tactical officer announced. And our scans show the human settlement concentrated in the valley region near the primary water source. Excellent, Vorath replied, his scaled lips pulling back to reveal rows of serrated teeth. Begin the assault and broadcast the standard surrender terms on all frequencies. The Dominion's approach to conquest was simple and effective, honed through dozens of successful campaigns against species across the galaxy. And it relied on overwhelming force combined with immediate psychological pressure that broke enemy resistance before it could properly form within hours. Vorath expected to have the human colony under complete control, their leaders in chains, and their population sorted into categories of usefulness for the Dominion's labor needs. His dropships touched down in the valley with military precision, and his soldiers emerged in their gleaming black armor, weapons raised and ready to crush any opposition. But what they found in the human settlement confused them greatly. The buildings were empty, the streets were abandoned. There were still meals on tables and toys scattered in yards, but there were no people anywhere to be seen, as if the entire population had simply vanished between one moment and the next. Search everything, Vorath commanded from orbit. They must be hiding in the structures, but the searches found nothing except evidence of hasty departure. And Vorath felt the first flicker of confusion disturbing his confident certainty. Sir, his tactical officer said, our sensors detect a large concentration of life signs in the mountain range to the north, approximately 40 kilometers from the settlement. They ran, Vorath said, and his confusion turned to contempt. They abandoned their homes and ran like frightened animals. He ordered his forces to pursue, confident that the fleeing humans would soon be cornered and captured. But the mountains of New Geneva were not like the flat plains where the Dominion preferred to fight, and the terrain proved far more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Captain Park Ji-hoon watched the Dominion column from a concealed position high on a rocky ridge, and he felt his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and grim determination as he counted the enemy vehicles passing below. He had 400 soldiers under his command, along with 3,000 civilians who were hidden in cave systems deeper in the mountains. And he knew that conventional military logic said his situation was hopeless. The Dominion outnumbered them more than 12 to 1 in trained soldiers, and their technology was superior in almost every measurable way. And any reasonable assessment would conclude that surrender was the only sensible option. But Captain Park had studied military history during his years at the Academy on Earth, and he knew something that the Dominion did not understand about human beings. Humans were not reasonable. Wait for the signal, he whispered into his communication unit. Let them get deep into the valley. The Dominion column advanced confidently, their vehicles spreading out across the valley floor as they pursued the fleeing colonists. And they had no idea that they were walking into a trap that had been prepared. During the 3 weeks between the invasion announcement and their actual arrival, Sergeant Kwon Yoonji pressed the detonator. The explosions tore through the valley with devastating force, collapsing the rock walls that the humans had carefully undermined. And within seconds, the Dominion's advance force was buried under thousands of tons of stone and debris. 200 enemy soldiers died in the first 3 seconds of the battle, and the survivors found themselves trapped in a narrow kill zone with no cover and enemies firing down from positions they could not reach. The Dominion troops tried to return fire, but their plasma weapons were designed for open field combat where their superior range and power would overwhelm any opposition. And in the confined mountain terrain, they could barely see their attackers before bullets came screaming down from impossible angles. Captain Park had positioned his best marksmen on the high ridges, soldiers who could put a round through a target from distances that the Dominion had never considered possible. And these snipers became ghosts of death that struck without warning and vanished before any response could be organized. General Vorath received the casualty reports with growing disbelief, and he demanded explanations that his officers could not provide. They are using some form of advanced targeting technology, his tactical officer suggested. Our soldiers are dying from single precise shots delivered from beyond visual range. Then use orbital bombardment, Vorath commanded. Destroy their positions from space. But the humans had anticipated this response as well, and they had positioned themselves in terrain where orbital strikes would cause massive collateral damage to the cave systems where the civilians were hidden. And Vorath knew that dead colonists had no value to the Dominion's labor needs. He ordered ground reinforcements instead, sending another 2,000 soldiers into the mountains to hunt down the human resistance. But every patrol that entered the rugged terrain suffered casualties from traps and ambushes that seemed to come from nowhere. The humans fought at night when their thermal regulation allowed them to function while the Finster shouldn't. Cold-blooded Dominion soldiers grew sluggish and slow, and they used the darkness like a weapon that the enemy could not counter. They attacked supply convoys and destroyed food shipments, forcing the Dominion to divert resources to protect their logistics lines, and they targeted officers specifically, learning to identify rank insignia and eliminating leaders before the common soldiers could receive orders. After 4 months of continuous combat, General Vorath sent a message to his superiors that he had never expected to write. The humans will not surrender, he reported, and they grow more dangerous with each passing day. And I require significant reinforcement if we are to achieve victory on this world. The Dominion High Command was not pleased by this news, but they sent the reinforcements anyway, because they could not afford to admit that a species of soft prey animals had stopped their mighty invasion in its tracks. What none of them understood was that Captain Park and his soldiers were just getting started.